The flight attendant's voice rang out, sharp and impatient. "You need to stop pressing that button or I'll make sure you're moved." Heads turned as Mr. Carter, calm and dignified, looked up and replied, "I have every right to ask for help." No one saw it coming. The man they tried to dismiss wasn't just another passenger. What unfolded next left the entire cabin speechless. If you believe everyone deserves respect, hit subscribe now and share where you're watching from. The cabin of Flight 827 buzzed with the usual pre-flight activity. Passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle, stowing their carry-on luggage and settling into their seats. The flight crew moved briskly, offering polite smiles and ensuring everything was in place. Among the passengers was Mr. James Carter, a dignified black man in his late 60s, dressed in a sharp suit and tie. He walked slowly, his back slightly hunched from years of hard work, yet his posture still carried an air of quiet strength. James was a retired school principal, known in his community for his wisdom and generosity. He had boarded the plane for a special trip to visit his granddaughter, who was graduating from law school, a moment he had been waiting for years to witness. As James placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment and took his seat near the front of the cabin, he nodded politely at the flight attendant passing by. "Good evening," he said warmly, his voice deep but gentle. The flight attendant, Lauren Hayes, glanced at him briefly. Her response was curt, almost dismissive. "Good evening," she replied flatly, moving on without a second look. Lauren, in her mid-30s, was known among the crew for her sharp tongue and rigid demeanor. She prided herself on maintaining control of the cabin, but had a habit of judging passengers based on appearances. And tonight, for some reason, Mr. Carter had caught her attention, not in a good way. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, and passengers settled in. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Lauren noticed James pressing the call button above his seat. She approached him, her professional smile thinly veiling her impatience. "Yes, sir?" she said, her tone clipped. James gestured toward the blanket folded on the seat beside him. "Excuse me, ma'am. Could I trouble you for a pillow? My back's been giving me some trouble lately." Lauren's smile tightened. "We only have a limited number of pillows, and they're typically reserved for first-class passengers. You'll have to make do with the blanket." James nodded politely, not wanting to cause trouble. "I understand. Thank you anyway." Lauren turned sharply on her heel, muttering under her breath as she walked away. "Some people think they're entitled to everything," she said, just loud enough for another flight attendant nearby to hear. Other passengers in the surrounding seats noticed the interaction, exchanging glances. A young woman sitting across the aisle frowned, clearly uncomfortable with Lauren's tone. She leaned toward her companion. "Did you hear that? Why was she so rude to him?" she whispered. Her companion shrugged, whispering back, "Maybe she's having a bad day. Still, that was uncalled for." Unaware of the whispers around her, Lauren continued about her duties, though she occasionally shot glances toward Mr. Carter's seat. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, his presence seemed to irritate her. To her, he didn't fit the profile of someone who should be seated near the front of the plane. An hour into the flight, James politely pressed the call button again. This time, he asked for a cup of water. Lauren brought the water to him, setting it down on his tray table with an audible sigh. "Is there anything else you need?" she asked, her tone bordering on sarcastic. James looked at her calmly, unfazed by her attitude. "No, thank you. I appreciate your help." Lauren didn't respond. Instead, she rolled her eyes and walked away, her frustration evident to everyone nearby. As the flight went on, Lauren's behavior became more blatant. She ignored James when he waved to get her attention, spoke curtly to him whenever he asked for assistance, and even made a snide remark to another crew member about passengers thinking they owned the place. Toward the middle of the flight, the young woman across the aisle, Emma, a journalist in her late 20s, decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. She pressed her own call button, prompting Lauren to return to the front of the cabin. "Yes, ma'am?" Lauren said, her professional mask slipping slightly as she saw Emma's serious expression. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help noticing how you've been treating that gentleman over there," Emma said, gesturing toward James. "He's been nothing but polite, yet you've been dismissive and rude. Is there a problem? Lauren stiffened, caught off guard. I'm sorry if you think that, but I assure you I'm treating all passengers equally. Emma raised an eyebrow. It doesn't seem that way, and I think you might want to reconsider how you speak to people. Everyone here is paying for this flight after all. Lauren's face flushed, and she mumbled something under her breath before walking away. James, having overheard the exchange, nodded gratefully at Emma, his eyes warm with appreciation. As the flight neared its destination, Lauren was called to the back of the plane for a routine crew check. While she was gone, Emma leaned over to James. "Sir," she said softly, "I couldn't help but notice how patient you've been through all of this. I admire your grace." James smiled gently. "Thank you, young lady. I've learned over the years that losing your temper doesn't solve anything. Kindness and patience go a long way." Emma nodded, moved by his wisdom. "I think you're handling it better than most people would." What no one realized at that moment was that Lauren's behavior wasn't going unnoticed by the airline's management. James wasn't just any passenger. He had connections that would soon bring justice to light. The plane landed smoothly at its destination, but the tension in the first-class cabin remained palpable. As passengers began gathering their belongings, Lauren Hayes stood at the front of the plane, her usual stern expression firmly in place. She avoided eye contact with Mr. James Carter, though she couldn't ignore the subtle whispers among the passengers as they filed past. James remained seated, waiting patiently as the aisle cleared. He wasn't in a rush. He had learned long ago that patience often revealed more than impulsive reactions ever could. Beside him, Emma leaned over. "Are you sure you're okay, sir?" she asked softly. James nodded with a small smile. "I'm fine. But thank you for standing up earlier. That took courage." Emma hesitated, glancing toward Lauren. Someone had to say something. She was out of line. James chuckled lightly, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "Don't worry. I have a feeling things will balance out soon." As the last passenger exited, James finally stood, retrieving his briefcase from the overhead compartment. Lauren turned toward him, her professional smile returning, though it was laced with annoyance. "Have a good evening, sir," she said flatly, clearly eager to end the interaction. James paused, his gaze steady. "You too, Ms. Hayes," he replied calmly. "But I suspect your evening might get a bit more complicated." Lauren blinked, confused. "Excuse me." James didn't answer. Instead, he stepped into the aisle and made his way to the exit. Waiting just outside the plane was a man in a sharp suit, his expression serious. He approached James with a warm handshake. "Mr. Carter, I trust your flight was informative," the man said, his voice low but deliberate. James nodded. "It was. Thank you for arranging everything." Mr. Collins Lauren, who had followed James to the exit, froze in place. "Who is he?" she wondered, her stomach knotting as she watched the interaction. She noticed the airline badge pinned to Mr. Collins's lapel. He wasn't just anyone. He was part of upper management. As Lauren stood rooted to the spot, Mr. Collins turned toward her. "Ms. Hayes," he said firmly, "I'd like a word with you in the terminal, please." Lauren's heart dropped. "Of course," she stammered, trying to maintain her composure. She followed Mr. Collins and James into a private conference room near the gate, her mind racing. Once inside, Mr. Collins closed the door and turned to James. "Would you like to start, sir?" James nodded, setting his briefcase on the table. "Ms. Hayes," he began, his tone still calm but now carrying an unmistakable authority. "You may not realize this, but I'm not just a passenger. I've been working with your airline for several months as a consultant on customer relations and training programs. My goal is to ensure that every passenger, regardless of who they are or where they come from, is treated with respect and dignity." Lauren's face drained of color. I didn't know," she stammered. "No, you didn't," James interrupted gently. "But that's no excuse. Today, I observed behavior that goes against everything this airline claims to stand for. You singled me out, dismissed my requests, and made derogatory comments loud enough for others to hear." Lauren opened her mouth to protest, but James held up a hand. Please, let me finish. I've been in this industry long enough to know that one person's attitude can set the tone for an entire flight, and today you failed to set the right tone. Mr. Collins stepped forward, his expression firm. Ms. Hayes, Mr. Carter was on this flight as part of a review process we're conducting for our crew training program. His report will carry significant weight in determining how we move forward. Lauren's voice shook as she tried to explain. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. I was just stressed, and stress is no excuse for poor behavior, James said firmly. Every passenger on that plane deserved your professionalism, regardless of how you were feeling. Mr. Collins nodded. As of now, you are suspended from duty pending a full review of today's incident. Depending on the outcome, additional action may be taken. Lauren's shoulders slumped, the weight of her actions finally sinking in. I understand, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. As Lauren left the room, James turned to Mr. Collins. Let's not just focus on punishment. Let's ensure she receives the training and support she needs to do better moving forward. Mr. Collins nodded thoughtfully. Of course, Mr. Carter. Your input has been invaluable. James smiled, a hint of warmth returning to his expression. People can change if they're given the chance, but they have to recognize their mistakes first. Weeks later, Lauren completed the airline's rigorous retraining program, her attitude transformed by the experience. She sent a handwritten letter to James, apologizing for her behavior and thanking him for giving her a chance to grow. James read the letter with a smile, reflecting on how one small action could ripple outward to create meaningful change. As he prepared for his granddaughter's graduation, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, not just in his work, but in his belief that grace and accountability could coexist.